Hi, and welcome to yet another APUS History Project. Today, we are going to compare and contrast the presidencies of Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. Here we have a wild Warren G. Harding in his natural habitat, the White House. Hey look, he's already becoming acquainted with all the other presidents in the White House. Not surprisingly, all three of the presidents are getting along because they are all Republicans, which means that they share similar ideologies. Oh wait, never mind. Herbert Hoover and Warren Harding are now fighting over whether taxes should be higher or lowered in the United States. How dare you lower taxes for big businesses and wealthy people? I believed that it was necessary to do so. How about you? Using the Revenue Act of 1932, I greatly increased the amount of taxes that wealthy people had to pay in an attempt to increase tax revenue. Fight! Well, I cut taxes too, in case anybody cares. Warren Harding and Herbert Hoover had very different views on taxes. Unlike Herbert Hoover, Warren Harding lowered taxes for business and the wealthy, which ended up being a positive thing that he did during his presidency. Because he lowered taxes for the wealthy, this gave businesses the opportunity to grow and helped ordinary citizens to make more money. Hoover did the exact opposite. Herbert Hoover raised taxes for the wealthy citizens using the Revenue Act of 1932. But this proved to be unsuccessful since citizens were angered by the fact that they had to pay significantly higher taxes. During this time, Herbert Hoover increased the income tax rate from 25% to 63%. And doubled the corporate and estate taxes to 15%. The presidents have now settled their disputes, since they all agree that the United States should increase tariffs. During my presidency, I set in place the emergency tariff known as the Ford-Meade-McCumber tariff in 1921 after my inauguration. The tariff increased import taxes on all imported goods from 15.2% in 1922 to 36.3% in 1923. This tariff was intended to protect factories and farms and to display a pro-business attitude by furthering trade and giving loans to Europe, which ultimately provided the United States with more goods. What a great idea, Warren Harding. The political cartoon, which is called the Cash Register Chorus, is representative of Calvin Coolidge's signing of the 1924 Revenue Act and the 1926 Revenue Act. Calvin Coolidge's Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, decreased taxes for the wealthy twice. Also, Calvin Coolidge was a strong believer in the idea of laissez-faire, which meant that he thought that if big businesses were left alone, that this would cause America's economy to prosper, and that it would also give citizens more access to jobs, which is reflected through these acts. These acts lowered tax rates for the working class and lowered taxes on industry, which was ultimately successful. Because of the 1924 Revenue Act and the 1926 Revenue Act, this helped to pay off America's national debt and even decrease the federal deficit. The political cartoon shown is representative of the fact that Calvin Coolidge believed in a laissez-faire economy. This was based off the government leaving big businesses alone, decreasing taxes for the wealthy, and also increasing tariffs to prevent foreign producers from being able to compete with American markets. The political cartoon, which shows businessmen singing, "What a Friend We Have in Coolidge," is a play off a hymn called "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." This is important because Coolidge, as portrayed through the photo, is being represented as almost a godlike figure for fighting for big businesses and succeeding. Although the act helped to be rid of the national debt and federal deficit, it completely disregarded the impoverished people who weren't wealthy industrialists. Laissez-faire capitalism, as represented in the photo, appealed to those who owned big businesses, since the government was supposed to be hands-off and wasn't expected to interfere in the businesses. This caused businesses to decrease working conditions for laborers and workers, and they were also able to change the wages in which the laborers received. Although the 1920s was a time in which people were getting more rights, it was also a time of traditionalism and nostalgia. Similar to the 1920s, the late 1800s and very early 1900s also had issues with the government regulating the amount of time that the workers worked, which led to poor working conditions, which just shows the level of traditionalism that was still consistent within the government. Even though the working conditions during the 1920s weren't suitable for laborers, they were greatly improved in comparison to what the working conditions were like during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Which just shows how the 1920s both exuded traditionalism and was also moving forward. It's really nice to finally meet somebody who dislikes the idea of immigration as much as I do. I know, it's hard to find presidents who limit immigration nowadays. I really support the Johnson Immigrant Quota Act of 1921. It's the idea that the immigration rate of a certain nationality shouldn't exceed 3%. Well, I ordered for the deportation of many Mexicans between the years 1929 and 1933. I also decreased the number of visas for immigrants if they wanted to come into the United States and work. You're such an inspiration. Really, I passed the Immigration Act of 1924. The political cartoon shown is representative of the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which was brought into effect by your favorite president, Warren G. Harding. It was the first act that set numerical limits on the amount of European immigrants who could come into the United States. Only 3% of European immigrants could come into the United States because of this act. The United States put this act in place because of the fear that Europeans would not integrate into American society, and they also thought that Europeans threatened the country's existence. The political cartoon shown negatively depicts Uncle Sam because there were several European immigrants who were eligible to come into the United States, but because of the amount of people who were allowed to immigrate was limited to only 3%, very few of them were allowed to come and live the American dream. This act is reflective of the changing attitudes and increased tension since people in the late 1800s and early 1900s were encouraged to live in the United States, due to the fact that this would stimulate the economy and mass consumption since most of them worked in low-wage jobs for long periods of time. This increased tension since many Europeans wanted to live in the United States because it was supposedly the land of the free, and it would give them opportunity, but most of them were denied access because of their nationality. Now we are going to talk about and compare two quotes from Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. Our government rests upon religion. It is from that source that we derive our reverence for truth and justice, for equality and liberality, and for the rights of mankind. Unless the people believe in these principles, they cannot believe in our government. There are only two main theories of government in our world. One rests on righteousness and the other on force. One appeals to reason and the other appeals to the sword. One is exemplified in the Republic, the other is represented by despotism. The government of a country never gets ahead of the religion of a country. There is no way by which we can substitute the authority of law for the virtue of man. Of course, we can endeavor to restrain the vicious and furnish a fair degree of security and protection by legislation and police control. But the real reform which society in these days is seeking will come as a result of our religious convictions, or they will not come at all. Peace, justice, humanity, charity. These cannot be legislated into being. They are the result of divine grace. Ever heard of separation of church and state? And the award for longest quote in existence goes to Calvin Coolidge. Anyways, here's Herbert Hoover's quote that contrasts Calvin Coolidge's quote. Next to religion, baseball has had a greater impact on our American way of life than any other American institution. Although both of these quotes have to do with religion, they both directly relate to politics because you can clearly tell that Calvin Coolidge had more traditionalist views during the 1920s, and Herbert Hoover was representative of the changing attitudes during this time period. Calvin Coolidge expresses how religion and government should be directly tied together, which is exactly how Virginia was run in 1624. During the time in which America was colonizing. During the time in which the Anglican Church was in control of the government in 1624, their government was not tolerant of people who were not Christian. Similar to early Virginia, Calvin Coolidge believed that unless people believe in these principles, they cannot believe in our government. Like early Virginia, Calvin Coolidge believed that the government should be based off of and align with Christianity. And if people didn't adhere to that nostalgic mindset, then they could not and did not believe in America's government. Coolidge's views on religion and the government increased tensions during the time of the 1920s, since Darwin's theory of evolution conflicted with Christianity. Herbert Hoover's quote about how baseball, next to religion, has had a greater impact on society in America than any other institution, just showed the importance of baseball as the national pastime, a direct result of the strong economy in that decade, which afforded workers more leisure time. I kind of caused the stock market to crash, and now America's going into the Great Depression. Well, I'm going to die in 1923 of an alleged heart attack anyways. Sponsored by the Warren Harding gravesite. Just kidding, who goes there?